want to thank you for your patience. Unfortunately, we're trying to live in an EE world that still has kinks in it, I guess. You know, we wanted to save the carbon emissions from Andrew's travel, but we didn't get the electronics working. So one of our panelists for the second panel is going to join us to talk about the topic of the first panel. And we're just going to go ahead to get set up and sit down and get started. So thank you for your patience.
So for you to hear me, I have to be quite close to the mic. Like I'm on the radio announcers. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Center for Ethics and Human Values half-day conference on climate justice and the Paris Agreement. My name is Corey Katz, and I'm the postdoctoral researcher in the ethics of sustainability and here at the center. And before we begin our panel, I'd like to make a number of thank yous. First, I'd like to thank the Ohio State's Office of Energy and the Environment for funding my research position. OE created this position to continue to build with other organizations like the Sustainable and Resilient Economy Program to build a campus conversation on questions of value and fairness and their relation to the technological, political, and economic challenges of sustainable development. And I think it's a really forward-looking vision for the office that's in charge of energy efficiency of buildings and developing the technical side of green energy to realize that there are questions of value and fairness that come into that and that should be discussed. Second, I'd like to thank the staff at the Center for Ethics and Human Values, Krista Johnson, Lavender, and Steve Brown, who were here quite early getting all of this set up and really have done a great job on the logistics for this conference. And I'd like to thank Don and Pierce Turner for their guidance in the center over the past couple of months. And I'd like to thank our panelists for making the trip in. And I'd like to thank you for coming this morning and for your patience. I promise this is going to be worth it. It's going to be an interesting and a very important discussion. And I know you didn't come here to hear me talk, but I hope you'd indulge me just to give you a brief overview of what impelled me to bring this group of people together today. And also to just give some background to our conversation. First, the science of global warming. Global warming is happening. Numerous sets of observations confirm that global average temperature rose 0.85 degrees Celsius between 1880 and 2012. Right? So we have confirmed observations of warming, and so scientists say, why is this happening? What's a good hypothesis that explains this phenomenon? And it turns out the best hypothesis is that the increased burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, and land use change since the Industrial Revolution have led to increased concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and these concentrations have been physically measured. And we know that those concentrations contribute to a rising global average temperature. And I'm sure you're all aware of many of the predictions, many of the costs, many of the harms that will result from that rising temperature. And just to give some context to our discussion in terms that we might be using, there's two ways that we could lessen the risks and the harms that might result from climate change. One is called mitigation, and that's where we minimize further warming by making cuts in our greenhouse gas emissions. And the other way is called adaptation, and that involves changing our social and economic systems across all societies to protect the members of those societies from being harmed by climate change that is, some of which is inevitable. Right? So for an example, you might address sea level rise by building a sea wall to protect coasts from harms of a rising sea. So there are mitigation and adaptation might be terms that you hear in our discussion. Second, there's the issues of justice that we're going to be talking about, issues of fairness, issues of equity. And moral philosophers really over the last, since the early 2000s have really started to get interested in the relation between climate change and justice. And these various ways that climate change relates to justice and fairness are going to come out in our discussion this morning. There are issues about distributive justice, of sharing benefits and burdens across different groups, across generations, across countries. And there's questions about how should we share the cost of mitigation and adaptation amongst countries. There's also questions about corrective justice. Right? It's just true that the industrialized countries are the ones that have emitted the most greenhouse gases, that have caused this problem, that are going to cause harm to others. So, for example, do industrialized countries owe compensation to those who are harmed by climate change? There's also questions about procedural justice and fairness in the global negotiations. Do some groups have more power? Do some groups have more voice in the political discussion that then results in some kind of agreement that might not represent equality between all the parties? And finally, we get to the question for today, which is how do justice, fairness, and equity relate to the global politics and the global negotiations that have tried to ensure mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And global negotiations on climate change have been going on since at least 1992. In 1992, I was 10 years old. So that means we've been trying to address this problem at the global level since I was 10 years old. I won't tell you how old I am now. But we've really yet to achieve a treaty at the global level, and we haven't really been able to stop the rise in global greenhouse gas emissions. And if philosophers are right that the moral imperative to address climate change is pressing, and they're right on what would count as a fair sharing of the burdens and the benefits of mitigation and adaptation, if all of that is, we could say, philosophically clear, then why have global negotiations been so ineffective at addressing this problem, never mind addressing the problem in a way that's equitable and fair? So our first panel this morning reflects on what global negotiations have recently been able to achieve, which is the 2015 Paris Agreement. So I'd just like to just briefly introduce our panel. On our first panel this morning, we have Idil Boran, and right here. And Idil is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at York University in Toronto. And I'd just like to make a shameless plug that Idil and I have just finished an entry on climate justice for the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That will be available in May, so check that out. We also have Dan Bodansky at the far end. Dan is Foundation Professor of Law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University, among other appointments. And he's a leading authority on international environmental law and the global climate negotiations. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get Andrew on Skype, but we have a much better...
Try one more time.
Try one more time.
You there?
His camera's not
Andrew
working.
is a former senior climate change negotiator for the U.S. Department of State, and he's a university professor of philosophy, public policy, and atmospheric sciences, and director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at George Mason University. And he's also a distinguished senior fellow in the climate program at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C. And finally, we have Sonia Klinsky.
Who can stay in this panel or she can move back?
Wherever you like.
I'll stay.
Stay. All right. And we have Sonia Klinsky, who's graciously joined our morning panel. She's a senior sustainability scientist at the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and an assistant professor at Arizona State University. So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. So the focus of, as I said, the focus of our panel is really an historic event, which was the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. it was the first time that an agreement on climate change action was agreed to and signed by all the countries of the world. And so my first question for the panel is, what did these countries agree to? What is the kind of fundamental parts that have been agreed to in the Paris Agreement? And why don't we'll start with Sonia, then Andrew, then Idil, and then Dan.
Okay, so thanks very much. I'll keep my answer really short because there's lots of layers to this. Can people hear me or no? I'm being told to speak closer to the microphone, so I will do so. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Paris Agreement, Dan probably is actually the best person to answer this question on this panel in some ways, but it is essentially an agreement that most countries have signed on to in one way or another. It sets up a fairly light framework which explains that all countries are aiming towards this goal of 2 degrees with the possibility of a 1.5 degree target. And the sort of hardest part, or the most sticking part of the agreement, is the idea that every 5 years countries will report back on what they are working on. There's some kind of frameworks for evaluating and comparing their costs across countries so that countries can be kind of held to account by their peers, so that when you say you're going to do something, you really do it. And the kind of the heart at the center of it are these things called nationally determined contributions, in which countries articulate what they will do to contribute to the global climate challenge. And every country is encouraged to submit these, and these are kind of the things that other countries can then look at and compare against what they're doing and learn from. So that's a very light kind of overview. I'm not sure at what depth people in this room are comfortable with. And so then I'll leave it there and expect that my panelists will provide some greater fine-tuning of the details.
Great, thank you. Andrew, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, would you like to give your summary or review of what was agreed to in the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, so I was one of the negotiators of the Paris Agreement, so, and I would sort of say that really there's 2 issues here. One, what did they agree to, and what did they accomplish? And what they agreed to, you just heard some of the bare bones of it. I think that without going into the 26 pages of the agreement itself, and then there's even more pages of what's called the decision text, which lays out a lot more of the rules on this. There's 2 really big parts of this. The first thing they agreed to was their pledges, was putting forward pledges. The vehicle was called Independent Nationally Determined Contributions, or now just called Nationally Determined Contributions. Before the first gavel came down in the 2 weeks of the negotiations of Paris in December 2015, 188 countries out of over 190 parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change had put forward some kind of pledge of their intention to reduce their emissions either to 2025 or 2030. If we were to look at the total coverage of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, those 188 countries represented some 98.5% of global emissions. Now, that doesn't mean they were committing to a reduction, of course, of 98% by some date, but they covered 98%. By comparison, the Kyoto Protocol at its top, at its height, which was the first climate agreement that emerged from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, only covered some 25% of global emissions, and then that was reduced along the way until 2009, 2010, when we tried another shot at this. And so the most important accomplishment in that part of the agreement is just we got covered. We got enough parties around the table to really be able to do something about the problem if those parties took on sufficient ambition. So that's part 1, those are the pledges, and that was there, that was sufficiently there in sufficient amounts even before we sort of finalized the text in Paris. The text that came out of Paris basically said, all right, a bunch of things. We are going to now create a process that will, over time, increase the ambition of parties to reduce their emissions even more over time in successive rounds of pledges, successive rounds of putting forward nationally determined contributions in basically a 5-year cycle beginning in 2025. This will be informed by a global stock take exercise. It will look at comprehensively what's going on with mitigation, adaptation, finance, everything else in the world, so that parties can make informed decisions about how they might increase their ambition over time. There's part of the Paris Agreement that basically says no backsliding. You can't sort of weaken your position over time. And then there's many, many other details that they agree to, we don't have time to go into now, again, on adaptation, loss and damage, finance, and many other parts of the package. The most important part of it, and again, just for comparison's sake, over what came before, is they agreed to the intention to create a universal transparency system. So a system like this, a bottom-up structure, where parties put forward pledges of what they're willing to do by some date in the future, and then create a process to move forward on it, is only so that kind of bottom-up structure, rather than say a top-down structure where parties agree to, all right, this group will agree to a certain target by a certain date, a common target, and they negotiate that. That's more the protocol structure. But a bottom-up structure where parties build on domestic pledges is only as good as what we can tell about whether or not parties are actually fulfilling those pledges. And so the transparency system that was created in Paris was a huge accomplishment in terms of what they agreed to, because they agreed to creating a universal system, though there will be some differentiation allowing for specific different national circumstances, especially for very poor countries, in the transparency they provide, but hopefully one where, say for example, we've never seen before, the US and China are to play by the same rules for how they account for greenhouse gases in their countries, how they demonstrate whether or not they are actually making progress towards their pledges, and then the process for moving forward. And so I would sort of say that's both what they agreed to and also in terms of what they accomplished.
Great, thank you. Idil, do you have something to add?
Thank you so much. This is Idil Boran, and thank you for the insights so far from Sonia and Andrew. And in fact, the audience has heard all the main components of the Paris Agreement. So what I want to do is to add one more layer to this discussion by highlighting that, in fact, what I want to do is to mention that Sonia has brought up the feature of the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, and then Andrew added the overall structure. So these are very important features of the Paris Agreement. And another thing that we heard from Andrew's account is that there is the actual text of the agreement, which is the legal text. But then that's not really the only thing that actually came out of the Paris Agreement, the Paris negotiations, and it was accompanied by the what's called the accompanying COP decision, or the decision of the parties giving effect to the agreement. And so what I want to highlight is a feature from that decision where parties agreed to invite not just the governments, which are the traditional parties to an international agreement, not just the government, but also all the other possible actors, which we call non-party actors, in order to provide their support, their help to the process of raising ambition. And so, roughly, this is a very broad category. So it's basically any actor that is not a sovereign state. So those include, for example, sub-sovereign entities like states or cities, but also civil society, NGOs, as well as the private sector. So the invitation was there to just come in and work together, not in the negotiation process, but in terms of what they can do to increase the overall ambition, because there's obviously an ambition gap, because there was great coverage, as Andrew highlighted, numerous countries have agreed to support the Paris Agreement, but obviously there's this ongoing discussion about whether governments are sufficient or sufficiently effective to generate a buoyant environment of cooperation for climate change. And so the invitation to include in the conversation the non-party entities, ranging from cities, states, sub-sovereign states, private sector, civil society, etc., that added a whole new layer of possibilities, but also new questions about how to think about the relationship between the sovereign states and maybe what we might call, climate citizenship, which is in some ways a global, it's a global picture that we have now of overlapping and crisscrossing network of possible cooperation between various actors that could help in the process. But of course, it raises new questions and also, definitely opens new opportunities. So this is what I wanted to add to the picture, so that we see the whole framework in its complexity. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we could say that the Paris Agreement has created a voluntary framework. So countries basically submit a proposal of what emissions cuts, what mitigation they think they can do, what kind of financing they think they could contribute to other countries to help them. And then there's, as Andrew said, there's a creation of a framework of transparency so that there's some kind of oversight. Are they really doing what they promised to do? Have they really been able to cut their emissions? And so that everyone kind of trusts that everyone is doing at least what they say they're doing. So I think Sonia and Idil and Andrew for setting up the structure. But I thought I would ask a different question to Dan, because Dan really knows the history of the global negotiation. So I wonder, Dan, if you would mind putting the Paris Agreement in context of the history of the negotiations. Is it a great success, or does it show the failure of a certain way the negotiations have gone over the last 20, 25 years? What is the place of this voluntary agreement in the history of negotiations?
Well, thanks very much. Am I close enough to the mic?
No, you'd be really close.
You have to be really close, like this. All right. So I unfortunately was not 10 years old when the Framework Convention was negotiated. I actually was there during the negotiation of the Framework Convention as an observer. And I've been following the climate change negotiations for more than 25 years now, I have to admit. So I think it is important to look at the historical context, because I think it's hard to understand the Paris Agreement without understanding how it came about and where it came from. So there are 4 instruments in the climate change regime that I think are key. So there's the Framework Convention, which was adopted in 1992, which establishes the general governance structure. And then there have been 3 agreements negotiated under it: the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, the 2009 Copenhagen Accord, and then most recently the 2015 Paris Agreement. And I think it's useful to think about these 3 agreements negotiated under the Framework Convention along 3 different dimensions. So one is the legal form. How legally binding is the agreement? Does it establish legally binding commitments, or is it a more political kind of agreement? So that's one dimension. The second dimension is it top-down or bottom-up? And Andrew already alluded to this. To what extent is it set through international negotiations, or to what extent does it allow countries to sort of do what they like from the bottom up and simply pledge what they intend to do? How much discretion does it leave to countries to decide on what their policies are going to be? And then the third dimension is differentiation. How much does it establish the same rules for all countries? To what extent does it have different sets of rules for different groups of countries? And the 2 big groups of countries in the climate negotiations have been the developed country group, referred to usually as the Annex 1 countries. They're listed in Annex 1 of the Framework Convention. And then the developing countries are the non-Annex 1 countries, the ones that are in Annex 1. So these are the 3 dimensions. And I think to understand the evolution of the regime, you have to sort of think about how the different agreements have addressed these 3 dimensions. So the Kyoto Protocol, it's legally binding. It establishes a legally binding commitments to reduce emissions. So it's very legalized in nature. Secondly, it's top-down. The targets for each country in the Kyoto Protocol were set through international negotiations. The U.S., for example, went into Kyoto during the Clinton administration with a stabilization target and came out with a -7 target, a 7% reduction target. The U.S. would not have chosen a 7% reduction target on its own. The 7% reduction target was the result of a lot of pressure internationally through the negotiations to come out with a stronger target. That made it then difficult for the U.S. to try to implement that target because it wasn't what they would have chosen initially. And then the third dimension, differentiation, Kyoto was totally differentiated. There were only commitments to reduce emissions for developed countries, but not for developing countries like China, India, other developing countries did not have any emission targets, whereas developed countries did. So that was the Kyoto approach. The Copenhagen Accord in 2009 was basically the polar opposite of Kyoto. So the Copenhagen Accord was not a legal agreement, it was a political agreement. There were no binding legal commitments under the Copenhagen Accord. The pledges countries made about reducing emissions were completely bottom-up. Each country got to just decide whatever it wanted to come forward with. They didn't look alike, they didn't have the same time frame. They were very hard to even understand what a country was committing to politically to doing. And then third, it was much less differentiated because the Copenhagen Accord established a pledging process that encompassed both developed countries and developing countries. So when Andrew said there was much broader coverage in the Paris Agreement than in the Kyoto Protocol, there was also much broader coverage in the Copenhagen Accord pledges than there is in the Kyoto Protocol. Now, the advantage of the Kyoto Protocol approach in theory, legally binding, internationally determined targets, is that you have more likelihood countries will actually reduce their emissions. The problem is very little participation. Very few countries were willing to take on these targets. The Kyoto targets only covered about a quarter of global emissions. Copenhagen Accord swung to the opposite extreme, non-legally binding, bottom-up, not so differentiated, much broader participation. The problem with Copenhagen was, in terms of the rigor of it, the pledges were all over the place, very difficult to understand, very difficult to even know whether countries were meeting their pledges. So with the Paris Agreement, I think the whole theory of the Paris Agreement was to have some hybrid, some in-between, some sort of middle ground, like a Goldilocks solution. So it's, on the one hand, it's a legally binding instrument, it's a treaty, but not all of the provisions in the Paris Agreement are themselves legally binding. In particular, the nationally determined contributions to reduce emissions do not establish legal obligations. They're political pledges like Copenhagen. So Paris on legal form, legal bindingness, it's somewhere in between Kyoto and Copenhagen. In terms of top-down or bottom-up, it's bottom-up in that each country gets to nationally determine what their emission reduction pledge is going to be, but then it has all these top-down elements that Andrew was mentioning to try to provide some kind of rigor. So there's transparency requirements. There are requirements relating to review. So there's some provisions in there that are through top-down negotiations to try to provide some international oversight of this bottom-up nationally determined contribution process. And then in differentiation, it also is in between. It establishes similar obligations, or essentially the same obligations for all countries, but then it has specific elements of differentiation that are much more tailored, much less sort of across the board than Kyoto. So in all of these three dimensions, Paris is trying to find some middle ground that's able to get broad participation like the Copenhagen Accord got, but also provide more promise of actually reducing emissions than Copenhagen.
Hey, great. So Dan brought up the kind of the transparency framework of the Paris Agreement is supposed to help with a problem, which is basically the problem of non-compliance, right? A country could promise to do X, but there's no, there's no binding reason, there's no binding law, there's no punishment, for example, if they don't do X. So I wonder if next the panelists could talk about, we have this voluntary structure in the Paris Agreement with a transparency structure that says you have to meet these certain sorts of reporting requirements so that we can trust that you're doing at least what you said you would do. But if that is the extent of the compliance mechanism, if there aren't, for example, penalties or sanctions or some kind of punishment in the treaty itself, how can we, will the treaty really be effective at getting the required emissions cuts from voluntary emissions cuts from countries? And I don't, would someone like to start on that, or?
I'm happy to say something, but whatever.
Okay, if you'd like to go ahead, Andrew.
Sure. So a couple points on that. I mean, first of all, this is is maybe worth a longer conversation. I believe that Dan would probably agree with me on this. This structure of the agreement was the only structure that was possible. So we have to work with what we have. And there's lots of reasons for that. We can go into the dynamics both the dynamics internal to the politics of the Framework Convention, primarily between developed and developing countries, as Dan said. You can talk about the historical issue on here. We tried a top-down treaty. It never got sufficient buy-in because of structure, because of parties like the United States that never joined it, that would have had kind of stronger compliance mechanisms. So that's one thing. I think there are various reasons for it. This was so we needed to do something. We knew, and Dan mentioned, between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, we had the Copenhagen Accords in 2009, where again we increased the overall participation of parties who are willing to make pledges. They were all over the place, but we got more participation. And there was no way we could have all of the parties that had agreed to reduce their emissions under the Kyoto Protocol zeroed out their emissions entirely. You just still wouldn't have had enough participation globally to achieve the overall goal of the Framework Convention, which is to try to get to some kind of acceptable level of emissions so that we prevent the worst impacts from anthropogenic warming. The second thing on this is I would sort of say that the Copenhagen Accord, which was also a bottom-up structure, which is when we saw the grid, even though it was a little chaotic, we got better participation than we did with Kyoto. We knew that we actually had kind of a formula that we could work on if we could do it better. If we could go for some kind of system that would create more rigor and better pledges, right, out of more parties, and that's what we achieved with Paris. But if you look at the actual track record of countries achieving their Copenhagen pledges, it's overall, most of the bigger emitters are on track to actually achieve those pledges. Now, there's many reasons for that, but I think part of this is also, we might want to talk about later, that conditions have changed enormously with respect to the solution set of climate change. That people know that it's cheaper now to transition to renewable energy. There's ways you can improve your economy. We've seen many countries, and indeed the entire world, begin to decouple economic growth from at least increases in emissions from the electricity sector. So the model's changing where there's more incentives. Two more points on this. The third thing I would sort of say is that the Paris Agreement, and this is something I cannot emphasize enough, the Paris Agreement was, I think, most successful in terms of what was actually achieved in breaking climate diplomacy out of its silo. So I wish I could see the look on Dan's face when I'm about to say what I'm about to say, but I think that Dan will probably appreciate the observation that back in 1992, climate change was not at the core of foreign policy. It wasn't what sort of the young, sort of member of the State Department would get into if they really wanted sort of a fast track to the top, right? We worked on nuclear non-proliferation and things like this. Climate was a very siloed part of international diplomacy. Fast track to 2015, and you really had an accomplishment, both from Secretary Kerry and President Obama, many other leaders of the world, where climate change broke out of its silo. It really was increased to the level that we see of international trade and national security, international security issues. That's how we got the Paris Agreement, by really elevating it. So the theory of the case there is that there will be a price to pay for countries who pull back. How big a price to pay? And the prices we're talking about is that other countries will potentially stop cooperating with them on other issues that they care about. Now, unfortunately, I think we're about to see, we could potentially see a very quick test of that proposition, with one of the biggest emitters in the world potentially pulling back from its commitments, maybe even potentially pulling out of the Paris Agreement itself. And we'll see what kind of price they have to pay. And that is the kind of the exercise of soft power here that that I think we at least those of us who work on the treaty, work on the agreement, believe would sort of be a good substitute for the hard compliance measures, which would have only been available in more of a top-down structure.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to weigh in on compliance and whether the treaty will be effective without hard compliance?
So I'll say something about that. I think it's very difficult to know, basically. There's been a lot of research done over the last 10 years or so as to how much difference international legal commitments make on compliance, and I think the short answer after all that research is we really don't know that much about how much difference it makes. But I think, I would say at least venture hazard to guess that all other things being equal, if it's legally binding, it's more likely to be complied with if there's hard compliance. But that's all other things being equal, and all other things are not equal. So if you, as Andrew said, if you have hard compliance, legally binding, with dispute resolution, very likely you have very low participation. And so if you're trading off the gains you get from compliance against the losses you have in participation, I'm not sure that's a very good trade. On the one hand, we do know that even when there's hard compliance, there can be a lot of non-compliance. So you can have a legally binding agreement with dispute resolution with significant violations. There's no assurance that even if you had a legally binding emissions targets, that countries would actually comply with them if they had economic difficulties doing so. So that's on the one hand. And we also know on the other hand that even non-legal instruments often can have high degrees of compliance if there's strong transparency provisions. And so the Paris Agreement is largely trying to achieve compliance through strong transparency review provisions. Now those don't work perfectly either, but I guess I would say given the political realities of when Paris was negotiated, better off to go with a system that would get broad participation, trying to rely on transparency and review processes for compliance rather than do a harder system that got very little in.
Great, Idil?
Yes, thank you. What I wanted to add, I find it's very illuminative, very instructive to hear indeed that empirically it's very difficult to tell how effective it's going to be. So maybe that's not really the point. But what I wanted to highlight is maybe to look at it slightly from a different perspective, because when we talk about the flexible and voluntary structure of the Paris Agreement, we tend to think that this might be a compromise. There's a tendency to think that, of course it would be better if it were, really legally binding, but this is the best that we can do. That's a very intuitive way of thinking about, the conditions of compliance. But as Dan has clarified, it's very difficult to see a complete correspondence between strong legally binding arrangements and then compliance. But one thing that we actually gain in some respects from trying a flexible and voluntary setting is that it actually can change the dynamics of the discussions. And don't forget, this is a global endeavor, and it is basically an endeavor where countries with very different circumstances, with very different levels of development capacity and economic circumstances that come together in order to be able to create a network of cooperation. So the one way in which we can see a virtue in more voluntary, flexible, discussion-based setting is that it can shift the dynamics from some kind of punitive you have to comply or you're gonna have to face fines or something, towards a path of empowerment where different countries from very different circumstances, and also again, as I said, even non-party entities in different parts of the world can maybe come together and they can try to find a voice together, so that there is, through a discussion, there could be maybe greater empowerment. So there is definitely some path to see in a non-binding, voluntary perspective. Of course, it's not clear whether it will indeed generate the compliance that we need, but nevertheless, the opportunities that it raises, especially for developing countries, in terms of coming together and being on par. In a setting of working together on a global scale, and to be given a voice, and also to be heard, so that we can so that there could be greater discussion between the global north and the global south in terms of the assistance that could be provided across state borders to raise capacity, to raise, also transparency. Transparency alone is something that needs to be worked on. It's not something that's given. So that's the perspective that I wanted to highlight. We can also try to probe the opportunities that arise from flexible, voluntary settings. Thank you.
I'll be really quick here, this word "we," I think many of us use the word "we" in this space all the time, and it always kind of makes me laugh, because who's the "we"? And as we've been talking about this, we've been keeping it quite technical, and you may have felt that, oh well, if I'm not in the room negotiating, this "we" isn't me, it's someone else. I think possibly the most interesting part of the Paris Agreement, and I'm actually I agree with everyone here, this is the best that could be done. Doesn't mean I love it, but I think it's the best that was it possible. But for me, the most exciting part is the idea of a review cycle, which is predictable. So we know every 5 years, and this "we" is not just those in the room, this "we" is everyone who cares to be informed, which is all of you. This "we" is every single person in the world who wishes to pay attention and know that every 5 years there's an enormous opportunity for every country to apply the largest domestic political pressure they know how to apply. So this is not about some abstract international agreement that only involves a handful of experts. The great thing about the Paris Agreement, and this is the one thing I really do think is a wonderful feature of the Paris Agreement, is that it gives every civil society member, whether you are an NGO or a business or a church or a mosque or whoever you are, a calendar, and says, if you care about this, you need to start organizing, you need to start reaching out, and you can actually be engaged from a domestic level. And you know when those periods of political attention are going to be. And for me, this is the most important part of the political process of the Paris Agreement, is that it democratizes it outside of a very narrow of experts at the international level only, and it puts the responsibility quite squarely in the hands of civil society in every single country.
Great. I think that's a really, I really enjoyed the kind of that diversity of perspectives on the agreement, because like Idil said, you might see the lack of kind of hard power and kind of penalties and sanctions if someone, or if a party doesn't meet their commitments as a failing, as a kind of concession to what's politically feasible. Or you might see it as a virtue, and you might see the 5-year stock takes as a virtue, as a way of democratizing, activity at the global level. So I think those are two interesting perspectives. I want to ask one final question of the group, and then open things up to all of you to ask questions. As you know, the topic of this conference isn't just the Paris Agreement, but it's climate justice, and all the different sorts of things that might mean, as I kind of outlined in the opening remarks, could be distributive justice or corrective justice or procedural justice, all of these ideas of fairness that come into play in the different aspects of climate action. And I wanted to ask the panel, how does the Paris Agreement instantiate different claims to equity, different claims to fairness? I know the panelists mentioned differentiation. Maybe they could say more about how that relates to ideas of fairness or equity. And then, was the agreement that got all these countries to agree and to sign, was that only possible by giving up some claims of justice? Did some parties have to give up what they saw as claims of fairness or justice in order to make this agreement possible? Does someone like to start on that?
I can start, but of course I'll be very happy to hear also the views of other panelists, because I feel that there are people who are even better qualified than I am to talk about differentiation. The question of international effort on climate change. And in many respects, this is because, as I mentioned earlier, that this is a global endeavor. Climate change is really a global problem, and it can be resolved through, or at least it can be addressed through the resolve of the entire population of the world. Now, of course, there's a specific structure in the world, and so typically the international negotiations happen between sovereign states. And so that is the starting point. But of course, even in that kind of setting, the first question that arises, and the first question that arose, is that given that there are different countries with very different circumstances, but also different levels of emission patterns, and also historically different levels of emission patterns, and also communities out there who have not contributed to the problem of climate change historically, either historically or even currently with the levels of emissions, who are in the most vulnerable position, then the very question of how to distribute responsibilities in a global effort has always been the central question. And that is what led to the question of differentiation in the negotiation. So that could be maybe a starting point, and I will let the other panelists to add to that. But the central idea is that it's over the distribution of responsibilities in the global effort.
Dan, would you like to go next?
So I guess I would say in the Paris Agreement, countries really didn't give up anything in terms of claims for climate justice. There is a provision in the Paris decision that nothing in the agreement provides a basis for liability or compensation, but it expressly reserves that countries can still make those claims outside the agreement. So countries are not giving up their potential claims through the agreement, they're just giving up their claims under Article 8 of the agreement itself. So I don't think countries were giving up a lot on what they could say about climate justice. On the other hand, the agreement doesn't say a lot specifically on climate justice. There's only one reference to the word justice in the entire agreement in the preamble. And let me just look at that. So and it's pretty qualified in what it says. It talks about that some countries are focusing on climate justice. I think there was a lot of concern about what the term means, a lot of disagreement as to what climate justice would entail, so a lot of wariness on the part of some states to put in a lot on climate justice. I do think you can look at the entire agreement, in a sense, as trying to promote some very, very broad kind of climate justice by setting up a well below 2-degree temperature goal with looking at 1.5, so that's trying to prevent the most serious damage from climate change to vulnerable states. So one could look at that from a climate justice perspective. The entire apparatus of the agreement that is trying to ratchet countries' contributions up over time so that their contributions actually ultimately do achieve the 2-degree, 1.5-degree targets is another element of the agreement that I think, very broadly speaking, one could interpret as promoting climate justice. But the agreement doesn't speak very specifically about climate justice as such. I don't think that's so surprising. I mean, I think what motivates countries in the negotiations is much more arguments about self-interest than it is about arguments about justice. And I do think that Paris negotiations sort of raise the question, apart from discussing climate justice from an ideal perspective, in the context of a negotiation like this, what kind of traction do justice arguments get? What gives them traction? Under what context or what situations do they get traction? In the climate negotiations, they provide a very, very important backdrop to the entire negotiations, but in terms of actually coming out through specific provisions, I don't think they get so much traction because most of the countries involved, it is a state-led negotiation, are focusing on how does the agreement serve their self-interest.
Well, Sonia and then Andrew, does that sound good?
Sure, unless Andrew wants to jump in. So I was at a workshop about a month or two after the Paris Agreement had been signed, and someone very boldly made the statement that climate justice was no longer relevant because the Paris Agreement had this self-differentiated framework, and the room erupted into chaos. Especially developing country participants quickly clarified that, in fact, self-differentiated did not mean that justice was no longer relevant. And the fact that it was not in a text did not mean that they didn't care about this and were not going to use it. So I guess this kind of comes down to, like Idil mentioned, these issues are so deep in the negotiations, but beyond the negotiations, right? Negotiations are only one very small part of this global effort to deal with climate change. They are an important part, but they are not the be-all and end-all of efforts to try to deal with the fact that we have radical inequality and we have climate change, and those two things intersect and always will intersect. And we're going to have to deal with those things both domestically and globally, whether we want to or whether it's convenient to or not. Now, do those things and can they be addressed in one agreement? No, they probably can't. This is one very limited agreement, and we can't expect it to solve all problems, and that is something we have to really bear in mind. So I guess there are some spaces where there are elements of consideration that I think are important. So we do have elements of funding for adaptation, which is a really important issue for equity. This isn't just about mitigation, right? This is also about what are we doing to protect basic human well-being, and that includes from climate impacts. And so there's an element of adaptation here. As Dan mentioned, there was quite a contentious, and I expect it will continue to be a contentious discussion about loss and damage. For those of you who aren't familiar, loss and damage is exactly those issues which are not easily avoided. They are the fundamental losses that aren't easy to monetize. These are the loss of life, the loss of your culture, the loss of your territory. How are you going to manage those things? And what are we expecting a global agreement to do with those kinds of losses anyway? We can't easily just put a monetary value on them and walk away. And so this is going to be, we can't say this is not going to be a continued conversation, because it will be a continued conversation. So the Paris Agreement also has some provisions about continuing to talk about finance. Well, this is a key aspect as well. If we're asking ourselves, the world, to transform economies, this is going to require investment. Even if it pays off, even financially in the long run, there's upfront investments that have to be made. And this is an element of equity, and this is in there as well. Now, does this solve it? Does it have a climate justice framework? No, it absolutely does not. But there are many sub-elements of this, or the interest in capacity building that has been articulated increasingly strongly, is a hook, is a place for those who want to work in the climate justice space to work in solidarity with the communities who are facing the greatest need. So there's lots of opportunities here, but it doesn't itself solve it, move it forward particularly, or use it as a heavy framework, but there's space there to engage, is how I kind of have come to terms with this agreement over time.
Great. Andrew, would you like to give some concluding
I'll try to
thoughts?
be brief so we can hear from people in the audience. But look, this is a process where you've got 194 parties and it operates by consensus. So it is just completely too much to ask for these negotiators to work out, acceptable text to, people who spend their lives thinking substantively about justice. It's not going to happen. And in a certain sense, I think it's very important that this is in part, that's a recognition of the pluralism here, right? That we had to create an agreement that everyone could look at it and sort of say, right, I can take this home and defend it as a just outcome. And I think we saw that even with the heavily caveated language that Dan pointed out in the preamble section on justice that was inserted at the very last minute by the Indian delegation and negotiated, the final terms of that were negotiated with the U.S. It was nonetheless important for Prime Minister Modi to put that in there. That's what the Indians told us, that we have to sort of get this in there in order before we get the agreement out the door. And Modi was able to take that home and claim that effectively the outcome was a just one for India. And that's what's most important, is that he was able to frame this and argue that it actually did, that the overall picture of it. Now, a couple other points on this. I think that the same thing about the consensus rule, and for those who don't know, essentially the UN Framework Convention was never able to agree on a system of voting other than a consensus, and so you revert to the UN default, which is consensus. Essentially, everyone has a veto. We can talk more about it later, but I have a chapter in a book where I've argued that the default consensus position, in fact, is a form of procedural justice, because it essentially means that the big parties can't roll over the smaller parties. No matter if you're very vulnerable and very, very poor, you can't be rolled. And we've seen parties come together in collections that have really moved the needle on what we would all agree with these substantive positions of justice. Loss and damage in the agreement because the small island states got together and said, we are not going to have an agreement that does not recognize that there are some kinds of climate impacts that we cannot adapt. And we have to figure out some sort of way of cooperatively dealing with that. So I think that that is fundamentally that's an example of default consensus being a form of procedural justice that wound up in a substantively an outcome which I think it is substantively just. In terms of the actual outcome itself, the sense in which the outcome itself represents some form of substantive justice, I would argue that the outcome on loss and damage, while people are going to argue that it's insufficient right now, certainly gets the conversation going there. And all of the mechanisms that were created, not just in the agreement, but around the agreement, the G7 parties and many other parties in the G20 banding together to create, for example, new systems of climate risk insurance for the small island states, in order to get the small island states to finish the job at the table in Paris and get the agreement across the board. That's not in the Paris Agreement. It would have happened without the process to create the Paris Agreement. And fundamentally, it represents a position where, the countries that are more responsible for climate pollution and carbon pollution are reaching out and helping those countries who are going to be in a more vulnerable position. And the final thing I was going to say about this is it would be up to debate, but I believe if you look at the overall distribution of the pledges that came out of Paris, and the estimates are that those pledges, this is our first round of NDCs, can stabilize temperatures at around, say, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, or 2.7 degrees Celsius. If we just had those pledges and nothing else, but of course we start a process where countries will hopefully come up with more ambitious pledges over time, that if we look at the full range of distribution of those, we have one where the richer countries who have committed more are committing to more reductions than the big countries who are also emitting a lot, but they were slower to the game, right? In industrialization. And they are also making substantial pledges in many cases. I would say China and India are very substantial pledges, not as requiring them to do quite as much as, say, the developed country parties. And it goes down the line with much less being put forward appropriately by the least developed countries, small island states, and others. And I think that the thing that is the context of this whole discussion that bothered me a little bit is you essentially frame Paris as an adversarial process. Is the compliance good enough, right? Is the outcome good enough from a perspective of justice? We cannot get to where we need to go with climate change if we are only creating an adversarial process in perpetuity. Part of what we wanted to try to do with Paris was to create a process where parties would race to the top, where we would point out solution sets they had not seen before. The global stocktake is not just about seeing who's not doing enough. The global stocktake process is about pointing to countries, what's the low-hanging fruit that you do not understand? Where's the transition in the energy economy that actually makes it more attractive for you to go towards a low-carbon path than a high-carbon path in order to meet your development needs? That's the world we need to move into. And then these questions of compliance and, is it the just outcome? These things should, at a certain point, fall off, at least on the mitigation side. And so that parties will sort of see that it's to their advantage to move in this direction. That's the kind of process we need to move forward. And if we cannot create that process, we simply will not solve this problem.
All right. Well, thank you for that, those perspectives on equity in the Paris Agreement. And so now we have about probably about 20 minutes for questions from all of you, but I'm going to have to give you my mic.
So we mainly talked about today about climate negotiation. Climate negotiation on an international level. Do these types of negotiations ever happen kind of on a national level from like maybe an industry standpoint? Do like manufacturing industries ever come together and say, by this date we want to reduce or increase the efficiency of our plants by this point, by this date? We want to reduce our carbon footprint to this amount by this date. Does it ever happen kind of on the micro level as opposed to the international level? And I guess more specifically without like government motivation. So government started kind of negotiations.
Someone? No?
Yes, thank you for your question. It's a very central one. Indeed, so the position of, there's no one position out there of the private sector. So the companies and the industry, the view is varied. There are definitely some companies that are very keen on doing something about, and even actually playing an important role in a lower carbon pathway. And then some others may not be as receptive. And in fact, as always, for everything there are early adopters and then late adopters. So the landscape is varied. But the point of, as I mentioned earlier in my interventions, the point of the decision giving effect to the Paris Agreement, making a specific point of inviting non-state actors, was precisely to allow that kind of forum outside the framework of the sovereign states, and to kind of create that kind of environment of maybe what we can call climate citizenship. So that discussion may or may not happen in a systematic way, but I think the possibilities are there, and one of the signal that we get from the international negotiation is to say, look, we need to have that conversation, and we need to do this in conjunction with the efforts of sovereign states. So I think there will be more of that kind of discussion that is more part of the citizenry.
I have a point of clarification. This is a very tiny point. This is something that I did not know when I first started going to international negotiations. When people in international negotiations talk about non-state actors, they are talking about every actor that isn't an actual country or sovereign state. So when they say non-state actors, that includes your city government. They are a non-state actor in this space. Your state government is a non-state actor in this space. So I just want you to remember that. So it's not just private companies that we're talking about in terms of non-state actors needing to kind of find ways of engaging here. It's also the democratic processes in everything from state and city levels as well. And there we do see a ton of engagement in the United States as well. So I just want, I'm not sure of our audience, I'm expecting a really mixed audience here. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone has that in their mind. That when we're talking about states, in this context, they mean really just countries, and non-states are everybody else. People don't know that.
Just to piggyback a little bit on the notion of non-state actors, so businesses, for instance, I think in terms of solving this problem, if there's a race to the top of corporations and businesses to enter the clean energy space, that would certainly be incredibly hopeful. For climate justice more particularly, it's interesting to me that this language is so tricky to get around. One of the other non-state actors would be faith communities, and so I teach a course on religion and environmental values, and we just looked at a range of faith community statements about climate change, and so the striking similarity between almost all of them is they acknowledge climate change, and almost all of them will mention justice as one of the key issues. And even, there's the rare statements that don't agree with the climate consensus. The Southern Baptist Convention has such a statement, and a group called the Cornwall Alliance has such a statement. And they turn justice around to say that...
I'm having trouble hearing the speaker.
Oh, sorry. Well, anyway, there's some turning this around of justice might even go the other direction if we don't allow fossil fuel development to continue at pace. That would be unjust for the development of developing countries. Even the justice argument is even being used sort of in the other direction. But nonetheless, it's very clear that for the faith community statements, justice is a real central concern. It's almost frontlined by everyone. So I wondered what the panelists thought about the role of that voice, particularly around justice in these sort of non-state collaborations, how much of a difference that makes.
If no one steps to jump, I'll speak to that first, then open up to my panelists. I don't want to take over here, but I have done quite a lot of work with the faith community. They are becoming an increasingly strong voice. They have a number of people who come to negotiations every year, but they're also doing a lot of work domestically. So for instance, if you look at the United Methodist Women's Convention, I think, for the next several years, be green as their main mandate for across the United States. And when you speak to those groups, I live in Arizona. We're a pretty conservative place. Climate change is not top on the agenda in Arizona, let me tell you. However, the faith communities are one place where you can cross political boundaries and talk about climate change from a totally different perspective. And I found here, this is an area where in the political space, as we were warned both by, I think, Dan and Andrew, we have to be careful when we talk about justice. We don't want to make this a burden. We don't want to scare people off. We don't want to make it this confrontational space. In the faith conversation, it's the opposite. It's talking about justice and underlying ideas of what is morality. Who do you want to be? What kind of a person and a community do you wish to be? It opens up the door, because then you suddenly have people who are like, well, I thought climate change was just going to destroy our jobs, but actually I am worried about this, and this does fit with my faith. And you can have a whole different conversation there. So I think one of the challenges here is thinking about in which contexts we're talking about justice. And I think in the international space, it can have a very confrontational side where people are worried about it, but those communities, I think, are often the ones who are not talking to the faith communities, where it's an incredibly powerful and bridge-building concept. And so I think we just have to be thoughtful about this as we speak to different communities.
Yeah.
So just a brief comment on the last two comments. So on the faith-based communities, so the question is how that translates into action to reduce emissions. And so one is changing individual behavior, so individuals change their behavior. Second is through market pressure, so people, in terms of what they're buying, are focusing on companies that have better climate policies. But I think ultimately it's going to require political action, and that's where I think the faith-based community is particularly important, because at least in the U.S., climate change has become such a partisan issue. And so one of the few ways of potentially trying to build bridges across the Republican and Democratic divide is through faith-based communities. So I think it has a lot of potential there. On the non-state actors more generally, so there's a huge amount of activity. There's sometimes called a groundswell of bottom-up action by non-governmental groups, environmental groups, companies, but also cities, states, local governments. Paris served to some degree as not just a negotiation among states to lead to the Paris Agreement, but also as a focal point for all of this groundswell activity. There was something called the Lima to Paris Action Agenda, where different companies and environmental groups and city initiatives came together to try to coalesce and publicize their work. In the run-up to Paris, the UN Secretary General had a climate summit in New York where there were announcements of all sorts of different initiatives. There weren't just governmental initiatives, national government initiatives, but also at the state and local level, and also by companies and environmental groups. So I think there is a lot of activity, and one of the things that the Paris conference tried to do, not so much the agreement itself, but the conference, was to try to bring together some of that activity, publicize it, give it more transparency. So I think that's another dimension of the Paris process.
Andrew, yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, just very quickly, I'd sort of say, again, I don't want people to be sitting in the audience thinking incredulously, we've got a president now who said famously in the campaign he will cancel the Paris Agreement, right? So everything we've been talking about is in fact under threat. We don't know when or if they will do this. I think there's an active conversation now among the administration with very different opinions on whether or not we should pull out of the Paris Agreement or potentially something worse like pulling out of the Framework Convention. And all this means that the things that have been mentioned here, the importance of cities, states, businesses, other organizations, adopting their own targets, putting them forth, is incredibly important in this country right now. The election happened during the last meeting of the Framework Convention, but in Marrakesh, just a couple days in. The response from U.S. NGOs on the ground immediately when they had to respond to the outcome of the election, knowing Trump's articulated views on this, or tweeted views on this, if you rather, is that the U.S. cities, states, and businesses are going to be moved forward. This is largely the same kind of argument we made during the Bush years, when Bush was pulling back. Cities and states are doing a lot, and I think that's true. We could talk more about that in detail, but the point of it is that if the U.S. federal government pulls back effectively, even if they stay in the Paris Agreement technically, formally, and pull back effectively on the finance side, on what they're going to do with respect to mitigation, I do expect this administration to go completely after the Clean Power Plan and other regulations the Obama administration put in office. And that means that we need more activity from states and cities. We need to also be able to count it accurately and represent it collectively to the rest of the world to say, look, there is activity going on in the United States. We are still a lot of non-state actors, right, as it were, cities and states and businesses who are moving in this direction, and they are trying to move forward and do more on that. And so there is still some effort being going on in the U.S. that can be picked up when we eventually reach a point in this country where this issue is not so divisive, ideologically divisive. And like many other developed countries in the world, many other developing countries in the world, there is no debate on action on climate change, and every government moves forward with some form of activity on it.
Great, next question.
Okay, can you hear me? I have a question about the role of developing countries in the negotiations. So observing the COPs, I've been struck by how important the groups are, the major negotiating groups, and in particular how dependent developing countries are on the G77, on the least developed countries group, on the African group, etc. And that in most of the negotiations, it's the lead negotiator for each of those groups that's representing large numbers of developing countries. So I guess my question is, do you think, do you have opinions on whether that part of the process does a good job of representing developing countries well? And I guess I'm sort of thinking beyond capacity issues. Is that a feature of the negotiations that sort of systematically disadvantages developing countries?
I think Andrew can speak to this very well.
Andrew, were you able to hear the question?
Was the question whether or not developing countries are well represented in the Framework Convention?
That's right. That was
And through the G77, for example, are those groupings effective at representing the developing countries and their interests?
I think they're enormously effective at representing their views, and I mean, you cannot get a substantive decision out of the COP unless you can actually get the buy-in from the major groupings among developing countries. I would sort of say, and this is where history is kind of a lesson. I think that the world of climate negotiations, after the Framework Convention was created in 1992, was fairly severely bifurcated between the developed countries and developing countries, just two kind of more or less homogenous blocks with some serious disagreements internal. But one of the things that really happened, I think, in the last 8 years, and was part of the success of the Paris Agreement, is that we saw a lot more fragmentation among the group of 77. And I would sort of argue that, I just gave one example before, we would not have had the loss and damage provisions in the Paris Agreement, the language on trying to also achieve a stabilization target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure if that's possible, but we wouldn't have that language in there, or make every effort to do so would not have been there. Without AOSIS, the Association of Small Island States, the African Union played an incredibly important role in the least developed countries. And one thing that all three of the least developed country groupings, and one thing that all three of those subgroupings of developing countries, the African Union, LDCs, and the AOSIS have, is that over time they began to see that they're not just threatened by the emissions coming from the US and Europe and other developed countries, they are threatened by the emissions coming from China as well. And that was absolutely critical, is that you didn't have a position where China could just be considered to be in the same grouping as the poorest countries in the world with the lowest emissions, and that its responsibility should be the same as those countries. Now that evolved a lot, and part of it was that many smaller countries sort of said, well look, if the problem is that emissions are the things that threaten us, then we need an agreement that is actually also getting ambition out of China. And I think the Chinese came to recognize this as something that would be an absolute threat to their claims to any kind of international leadership on this issue if they weren't responding to that call. So the answer is simply yes, but it's become, I think, more complicated among developing country groupings in a very positive way in terms of achieving overall ambition that we did.
Dan, did you want to?
Well, I was going to make essentially the exact same point Andrew just made. So I think this was a real problem in the early days of the negotiation because the developing country group is a very heterogeneous group. So there's huge differences between the small island states and the oil-producing states in terms of what they wanted. And in the early days of the negotiations, back in 91, 92, 93, they negotiated as a single block, the G77. And so AOSIS usually, the small island states would usually get rolled by the oil-producing states, and the G77 position, I think, much better reflected the countries that didn't want to do a lot of climate change than it reflected countries, developing countries that were severely threatened by climate change, like small island states, these developed countries. What's happened, particularly in the 2000s, I guess, G77 still meets and still makes statements, but there are very, as Andrew said, lots and lots of different developing country groups under the G77. Like AOSIS has been around a long time, but it speaks much more separately from the G77 than it did before. Least developed country group, sort of the more progressive Latin American countries. So there are lots and lots of different developing countries groups that I think much better reflect the diversity of developing country positions on climate change than was the case 20 years ago.
Just a very, very short follow-up here. The actual negotiating positions is important, but so too are the other things that those groups allow people to do. So you'll see they share lots of legal expertise, they share information, they share a variety of other resources. COPs, and one of them, I remember talking to a Swazi delegate, he's like, yeah, this is really, COPs, it's a team sport. You have to have a team. So this is a team sport. And he was totally right, it's a team sport. And so if you are on a really tiny team, you have a problem. And so some of those negotiating blocks have really helped people share the resources they need in order to be able to play effectively.
Next question?
Yeah, hi. So I've known Andrew a long time, actually. Hi, Andrew.
I can't hear this one at all. If you can
Oh,
get on the mic.
Put your mouth like right up.
I've known Andrew a long time, and he's.
Hi, Steve.
It's always nice to hear his optimism, and sense that there are lots of ways in which things are getting better. But I guess I'm not sure I share.
Sorry, microphone, Steve.
You're gonna have to yell. We're gonna come up and use one of our microphones.
Turn it up, there's a feedback. So,
Yell?
you gotta basically keep your mouth.
I guess I just actually would like to hear the other members of the panel also talk about what I think is the elephant in the room, which is the really significant political changes that have taken place, first of all, in this country since the Paris Agreement, and secondly, in other places in the world as well, and a kind of movement towards nationalism, in lots of different ways, and what the implications that are going to be for the process going forward.
Okay, great. If you didn't hear Andrew, Steve asked.
Yeah, talk about Trump. I got it.
Well, also, other forms of nationalism in Europe, and so.
Okay.
Would someone want to weigh in on that?
I can start.
Not with the technical stuff.
I'm going to start and let everyone else get their thoughts together because mine will be short. We talked about this, a few of us met for dinner last night, and we talked about how awkward it is to be in this space because we know that as we speak, we're also creating discourses. And so we're always talking, on one hand, we want to be very positive and encourage momentum and tell people, yeah, these changes are happening and governments are pulling out and possibly falling apart. But we still can look to all these amazing people who are working on the ground, and this is really positive. On the other hand, you worry that as you're selling that somewhat positive narrative, you're lulling people to sleep with, hey, don't worry, it's going to be okay. And I know for me, this is, as someone who speaks to a variety of audiences, this is actually kind of a personal moral question every day is, which narrative do I take and why? Because I think both things are simultaneously true. That we do have governments that are pulling back on this, and it's terrifying. If all the various changes that happen, I don't see how we could possibly make 2 degrees, much less 3 or 4, which terrifies me. At the same time, if we throw our hands up and say this is so terrible, there's no hope, we become nihilistic. And I think that we're all walking this line all the time, and it's down to each one of us, each time we think about this, is where we want to put ourselves in this. So it's not a very articulate answer, but I just know that's a very personal answer, but of what it feels like to realize that every time I open my mouth on this issue, I am creating these very powerful discourses, or contributing to them. But that's not a very technical answer, so I'll hand the technical answers to someone like Dan, who does technical really well.
I don't think there's a technical answer about Donald Trump. So let me just say that even before Donald Trump, even before the elections, I was, I guess, cautious about Paris. I think it was as good as we could do, but whether Paris was going to succeed in really reducing emissions really an open question. It depends on how well the ratchet mechanism works. The initial pledges countries made in Paris weren't enough. So the question is, would the process of every 5 years having a global stock take, countries coming back forward, would they have really up what they're doing or not? I think it's an open question. We won't really know that until the next round and the next round after that to see whether the trajectory is really shifting or not. So even before Trump, I'd say there was no guarantee that Paris was going to be enough. I'd say it was the best they could do, but it's far from perfect. Obviously, the political developments, not just in the U.S., but also in England, Europe, potentially, could have a tremendous impact. And I guess I would say, I don't view that as an excuse for nihilism, because it may not be that we can get to 2 degrees, much less 1.5 degrees, but 3 degrees is better than 4, and 4 is better than 5, and so doing as best you can, given the political circumstances, I think is all we can really try to do.
And I will follow up with a non-technical and more personal response, adding to these very interesting and very insightful remarks. So, and in fact, my perspective is going to be more personal, and it's going to talk more about the kind of the general aspect of rising nationalism. I mean, not just in a specific place, but it's a general. It seems to be a general trend. And I'm north of the border, and we are on the one hand outside the United States, but we're also very close, so we feel the winds very. It's very palpable. So, but look, I'm also going to allow my political philosopher's voice to come forth. And reflection on political matters, political theory itself is born out of crisis. It is born out of difficulties and social conflict. So I actually am not really warm to the idea of having a distinction between are you optimistic, are you pessimistic. It's in fact, it might even be a false distinction because times of conflict, times of tension can also be very fecund in terms of thinking about standards to aspire to, ideals to live by. And in fact, so this is one more point that I want to make actually with regards to justice. We kind of mentioned the concept of justice, but then we're kind of also a little bit perplexed about what to make of it. And I completely agree with Dan's remarks about the international negotiation, the Paris Agreement being reluctant to, the negotiators, including the language of justice, their reluctance to include in a very specific technical way. Well, it's because in many respects there is no such thing as justice out there. It's always a work in progress. There's a search for justice, and it's not like it's something that's there that we can somehow take and then the work would be done. And so in these circumstances, I think what the opportunity that arises is maybe to rethink, rather than, so in academic discourse, especially on climate change, justice has always been about, as I said earlier, about this distribution of obligations, responsibilities, and those are very important questions. But what is also important, and what has always been very important for political theory, is that justice is also about the relationship between the state and the citizen. And so it is not about having some piece of paper somewhere that's going to do the work for us, but it is really about how to think, how to embody the conceptions of justice, how to embody values within social life. Like it's something that has to be brought to life by people. Like we are the discussants of what justice requires on climate change, and the difficult times are just as fecund, I think, to really probe a reflection on that as not difficult times. And in fact, I would be inclined to think that if everything was perfect, then we wouldn't have any of these discussions. We wouldn't even think about what justice requires. So I think there's a lot to do, but not in terms of how legally binding this agreement is going to be, but how it can support a more buoyant social life that continuously think about what equity is, what justice is, what the responsibilities are, but what other requirements might be. Like, for example, how different countries can work together in a way that they can trust each other. So rather than being adversarial, as Andrew was highlighting earlier, we can maybe rethink the framework of justice more in terms of trust and cooperation.
Okay, great. We have time for one last question.
Can I throw in on that question? I mean, I think that Steve didn't want me to answer, but I just first like to keep being an optimist on this issue. Is it okay, Corey?
Yeah, that's okay. Go ahead.
So look, I'm not an optimist, Steve. I'm a realist about this. And it just sounds like optimism because I think I understand what the terrain is out there, a possibility, and that's all I'm pointing to. So 3 quick points. You all know now, if you didn't know before, because of this panel, I think did a great job of explaining this, is that the Paris Agreement is built on domestic pledges. It is as good as those pledges are. Will this administration go after the regulations the Obama administration put in place so that we can achieve our 2025 target and hopefully do more in the future and successive cycles of commitments? Yes, they will. They will go solely after that. They will. They will try to destroy them. And that will be stopped through its job at EPA. Part of its job will be to do that. The next line of defense, though, is that we need to try to keep them from pulling out of the Paris Agreement, because we don't want to have to we don't want the knock-on effect of U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement and then other countries also pulling out of this empowering. For example, I know there are many skeptics of about the Paris Agreement and whether or not in the Indian cabinet and whether or not the Indian government should have joined it. We don't want to empower them with the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement itself. So we have to try to stop that. Now, how do we stop it? As of this week, I can assure you, there are now senior members of the Trump administration who do not think we should pull out of the Paris Agreement or the Framework Convention. I believe strongly that includes the new Secretary of State. I believe that the 3 members that have now finally been appointed who have climate equities in the National Security Council also believe we should not hastily pull out of the Paris Agreement. So there's a conversation to be had. Steve Bannon, rest assured, wants us to pull out of the Paris Agreement. He's extremely ideological about it. That's a fight that's going to happen internally. It's important, our ability to impact that fight must come from the outside. So point 3 is that we need international pressure from other countries on the Trump administration that there will be consequences if they do this. Idil, your Prime Minister, is coming to Washington on Monday. If Trudeau does not mention climate change to Trump and the importance of the Paris Agreement, then we will have not done our job. We need to raise the stakes, right? That this is going to hurt Trudeau at home if he does not raise this issue somehow in this, and we are scrambling with Canadian NGOs to make this happen. The G20 meeting this year in Germany is the most important climate-related meeting of the year. It's the only meeting that Donald Trump has accepted an invitation to, where climate change will be on the agenda, and Angela Merkel has said she wants to reaffirm commitment to Paris, commitment to climate science, frame this as a national security issue at the G20. We have got to work to make that happen, and that's what I work on every single day to try to arrange things, not out of a nice sense of optimism, not because I'm Pollyannish about it, because I think there is a fight to be had, and there's a pathway to do it.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so we'll have one quick final question, and then we have about 4 minutes, and then we'll finish.
Sure, I'll try to be really quick. Hi, Cinnamon Carlar, College of Law. Hi, Andrew. So I wanted to, since Alex didn't ask this question, I'm going to ask this question because it's something he's thought a lot about too. Sonia, you brought this up, but we think about justice very often in the context of mitigation, and especially as the negotiations were framed over the years, but of course as time has moved on, we're starting to think much more about the thicker questions, distributed corrective justice, procedural justice, etc., in the context of adaptation. And one area for thinking through those questions in a very discrete format is through finance mechanisms, and particularly through the emerging, the new financing mechanisms. And so two pieces to this. The first is, What are your thoughts on our ability to mobilize financing for adaptation? That's a new goal. Of course, it's much harder than mobilizing mitigation financing. And then that's one of the justice claims. But the second is, what are your collective thoughts on how financing decisions are going to be made in the adaptation context in terms of prioritization, country ownership, and how do those questions reflect on justice in a way that's very discrete and actionable in the near term?
Andrew, did you want to start, or should I start, or someone else want to start?
What was the question, how do we mobilize finance?
There were two parts. I can answer. There was what are your thoughts about mobilizing adaptation finance and the extent that's going to happen? And the second one was how will finance and adaptation decisions be made in terms of prioritization, and how will that affect this larger conversation of justice? Do you want to take those on, or?
In the globe or in the United States?
That was a global level question.
Okay, global level. You started, I'll see if I want to add something.
So the first question is, I have no idea how we're going to mobilize enough money for adaptation at the global level. This is a huge, huge issue. I mean, the pledges have been made. The United States is not going to deal with its own issues about clean energy. If we can't even, in Arizona, for instance, put solar panels on our roof in a state where it's only rainy 9 days a year, trying to figure out how we're going to generate the depth of money we need for adaptation, I do not have an easy answer to that. I wish I did. This is a really, really important area. And I've seen all kinds of suggestions from sort of private sector leveraging strategies, but to be honest, none of them totally ring true to me yet, and I don't know. Great question. Maybe Andrew has insights that I don't have, so I open that one. And in terms of prioritization, this is another area where people have not gone yet. We know from there was a huge, one of the things that I think has been really interesting in the UNFCCC space is the discussions that were made around how money was going to be controlled in the adaptation fund. But of course, the adaptation fund is tied to the whole Kyoto mechanisms because it was funded partly through CDM revenue. So now we have the Green Climate Fund, which doesn't have the same rules about prioritization within it, whereas they were starting to talk in the adaptation fund about this. Now we have the Green Climate Fund, which, although it has an interesting 50-50 split window, which I think is interesting speaking to your first question, which is recognizing the importance of adaptation, within that, explicit conversations of prioritization are going to be really, really hard. And to my knowledge, they're not making a great deal of progress. I mean, even initially they were talking about privileging projects that were going to be quote-unquote transformational, but within about a year that was dropped because everyone realized, whoa, how do we measure this? This is an incredibly complicated thing to measure. So, frankly, those are two areas that I agree with you, they're totally important, but from my perspective, as an outsider to this process, I don't see a lot of concrete things we can hang on to there. But Andrew's more insider, so maybe he has a better sense.
Yeah, so thank you. It's a great question, and I should say 2 points. One on the global level, and one of the things that we also negotiated in 2015, which is quite an accomplishment, and Idil knows a lot about this, is the new Sustainable Development Goals. One of the most important things, these were the new list of development goals that replaced the Millennium Development Goals from 2000. They will run until 2030. There's quite a lot of them. There's, I believe, 169 targets altogether, and there's a long story about how that got so big. But the most important thing about it was that our philosophy of the case for how you integrate climate into development was to mainstream adaptation and also mitigation, but especially adaptation into all development assistance and all development decisions. And so really, we need to stop this, and there's been a very unhelpful discussion, I would argue, that all adaptation money has to be new, all climate adaptation money has to be new and additional to all development money. I think there's a case to be made for that, but I think that fundamentally, it also needs to be made that every dollar spent around the world on development, either as assistance or internally in countries, has to fundamentally be climate smart. It has to be making the world more resilient. And there's a lot more development assistance than there is climate assistance, and that's what the Sustainable Development Goals basically wrap their arms around that concept and give specific targets for very specific development sectors about how to achieve that. So we only finally get to where we need to be on climate adaptation finance when we succeed in transforming the whole way we approach development assistance. And I think that we made some good steps moving forward. We're going to take a hit on financing in general now, again because of the U.S., because I can also guarantee you that the U.S. will stop payments to the Green Climate Fund. That's not going to happen. And so the proportion of the U.S. payments to the Green Climate Fund, at least that would have gone to adaptation, will not be going into the bank. On the other side, though, I think that there is a lot of room here for continuing to try to pick up some of the slack for the U.S. Through foundations, through philanthropies, and the Gates Foundations and others are actually talking about that actively, given where this election is going to put us in that position. And the final point I'll make is that we're never going to have enough development assistance or adaptation assistance just relying on official development assistance, just, transfers of money one way from donor countries to recipient countries. We do actually have to crack open the formula of how do you create markets for climate adaptation in the same way we've created markets for climate mitigation. This is largely still an academic debate. There's been a couple reports where people have tried to sort of figure out how you can do this, and I think that now it's even more important that we try to do this so we can drive more private sector money, essentially feeding into our overall adaptation goals.
Great. Well, thank our panelists, and thank you all for your attention.